Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Always good to have on the line with us Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Thanks, Brian, but I really should be out on the golf course on a day like today rather than inside talking about politics.
Well, as we just said on the local news, it's primary day, and the big race that we're watching around here is the five-way Democrat primary for the Tom Reed seat in the House of Representatives. Wondering, right before we went on the air, if you could tell us, you live on a street where there's a lot of political signs. If you could share that with us.
Well, not a lot, other than to say that there are three political signs, and they represent supporters of three of the five candidates. In other words, it's not as if there seems to be some kind of a landslide here, at least on my own street here in the village of Alfred, for one candidate or another. It's difficult for me to judge at this point which of these candidates may be ahead, which of them may not be ahead. If the signs are any indication, I suppose one might say that these three are ahead. But I have no clue at all as to who's going to win this primary. I had met one of the candidates when I was at St. Bonaventure University a number of weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago. That was Tracy Matrano. But I really haven't seen the others in action, and I have no opinion, so to speak, as to which of these candidates is, number one, more popular, number two, better qualified for this position. They all seem like, more or less conventional, liberal, Democratic candidates.
If I could ask you a question that I asked Dr. Heineman the other day. Out of the different towns such as Jamestown and Ithaca, which would be more important in the district in terms, Heineman pointed out Jamestown is larger, but Ithaca is kind of a... I don't want to say a liberal headquarters, but there's a lot of progressives there, and that makes Ithaca important. Did you have any thoughts on the geography of this congressional district?
Yeah, I think the key to this primary is going to be turnout, as it is, I might add, in many, many different primaries. And during primary elections, for the most part, we don't get that much of a turnout in the United States. Maybe if we had a slightly different kind of registration system, not just a registration system, but a voting system, so that people, for instance, could vote by mail, as they do in some countries, and they do in some states, as a matter of fact. You might have a much larger percentage of the public actually voting in the primaries. But I think that Ithaca would probably be the somewhat more important town in respect to this primary today, and that's because there is a lot of political sentiment in Ithaca. You have two colleges, Cornell University and Ithaca College, where you have many, many people who are probably somewhat more motivated in respect to the election, especially this year, in light of Donald Trump's presidency. And for that reason, I would suggest that we're probably going to see more of an impact on the Ithaca side than we are on the western side of this election district.
Yeah, a lot of valid points there, Dr. Ostrower. Moving on by the way, we'll have coverage tonight and, of course, first thing in the morning. Moving on to the national scene, Dr. Ostrower, it's kind of a new thing where the conservatives who are public officials, such as Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House press secretary, or the state attorney general down in Florida, Pam Bondi, and there's been other cases too, have gone out in public places. Pam Bondi went to a movie theater. Sarah Huckabee Sanders went to a restaurant in Virginia. And they basically get chased out because of their connections and support of President Trump. Congresswoman Maxine Waters in California kind of came out at a rally and encouraged this kind of behavior. Then later Senator Schumer came out and discouraged it, and Maxine Waters kind of backtracked. What do you make of this whole phenomenon?
Well, it's a very, very contentious period that we're in, and certainly the president has done nothing to reduce that sense of contentiousness. Once upon a time, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but once upon a time, American politics was defined by a good deal of civility. Go back 50 years, 60 years, for instance, during the Eisenhower years, when there was a real respect on the part of the Republicans for the Democratic tradition, for the New Deal tradition. Eisenhower himself made it very, very clear as a Republican president that he was not in any way going to repeal the major pieces of legislation of that New Deal. And the Democrats, I think, responded in kind. There was plenty of disagreement, but it was civil. It was respectful. There was a sense in which politicians understood that politicians on the other side of the aisle were loyal. Okay, that sense that there was a loyal opposition. That has really broken down today, and I think that helps to explain why there's as much contentiousness as there is. And I mean, even for instance, Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked to leave a little restaurant called the Red Hen down in Lexington, Virginia. And this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, was 3 days ago, perhaps. And following that, the president responded with one of his many tweets to the effect that, the Red Hen is dirty, and if a restaurant is dirty outside, it should be dirty. It's probably dirty inside. It's just a very, very kind of uncivilized kind of comment, I think. And while his base may love it, I think that many, many Trump supporters probably love this kind of a response. It just further debases American politics. I've said here before that American politics has been characterized, most importantly, over the course of 230 years, by a willingness to compromise. And that willingness to compromise, which I have often called the genius of American politics, that willingness to compromise has only broken down in a very serious way once in American history, and that was during the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. And I see that willingness to compromise breaking down again. There are many, many Republicans. If you watch Fox and Friends, you get a sense that Democrats, progressives, liberals, call them what you will, are not loyal. Okay, that they are disloyal. And I think that again is a very, very corrosive kind of thing. And I guess I'd add one other thing, and that is that the Republicans who are up in arms over the fact that some of the political officials that you referred to before, such as the Florida Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristen Nielsen, and also, of course, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. Well, they have been called out publicly. The Republicans, the conservatives, have not exactly been kind to people on the other side. For instance, if you're gay and you happen to be married, you may be told you can't do business here. You can't get that wedding cake here. You can't have dinner here, and so forth, which is a humiliating experience. We know what's happening to immigrants who are being treated like second-class people right now, dehumanized in some ways by the degree of emotionalism that has increasingly characterized this whole subject of immigration in the United States. I think that's all a very, very sad. It's a sad development, and it exists on both sides of the political aisle. The Republicans, certainly the conservatives, I think, have been somewhat uncivil in respect to their political opponents, as we're seeing some of the Democrats somewhat uncivil in respect to their own political opponents. I think that's. I hope that's not characteristic of the next 25 years of American politics, but I think it will be characteristic so long as Donald Trump remains president.
As far as the future of the Republican Party goes, do you see it becoming more of a Trump-type party, anti-globalist, anti-free trade, and moving in that direction? Or how do you see it going? Because the Republicans up to this point were pretty much on the free trade bandwagon and got along well with Democrats, and Trump came along, and it was a real game-changing situation. What do you see happening with the Republican Party?
I think that the Republican Party today in the United States has become the Trump Party. And that's certainly not an original thought. Former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Republican, John Boehner, made exactly that point just about 1 month ago. If I'm not mistaken, as recently as yesterday in a Pew poll, we learned that 90% of Republicans are supportive of Trump. And yet the Republican Party, as you just indicated, used to be, the bedrock of that party, used to be based on the idea of small government, number one, secondly, free trade, and thirdly, balanced budget. And Trump has certainly pulled the rug out of under two of those three things. He is anything but a free trader. We see him seeking not only to impose tariffs against goods coming in from China, but also from Canada, from France, from Germany, and from a number of other countries as well, which will probably lead to a trade war, which may be very, very damaging. Again, I've said here before that no one is going to win that kind of a trade war. And secondly, we see him busting the budget. His tax cuts of a few months ago have led to an increase, will lead to an increase in our budget deficit by $1.3 trillion. That's with a T. $1.3 trillion over the course of about 10 years. That is so utterly contrary to Republican principles that, it makes my own head spin. And yet the Republicans today seem to be not at all critical of what the president is doing. And if the Democrats win the presidency, let's say in 2 more years, or maybe in 6 years, I don't see any reason to think that they are going to seek to balance the budget. And then you have to ask this question, which is, all right, how are we going to pay for this budgetary deficit? And the answer is going to be, we're going to cut back Social Security, and we're going to cut back Medicare, maybe even end the program, because that's where the money is. That's the only place you're really able to get the kinds of funds that will help to balance this budget. But for the short term, at least, I think that budgetary balance is a myth. I think it's gone the way of the horse and the buggy. And let me mention one more thing, which is raised by your question, and that has to do with kind of that liberal political order that has characterized the entire West since World War II. And this is a product of President Franklin Roosevelt, of Harry Truman, certainly of Republican Dwight Eisenhower. They created a structure of peace that was based on international cooperation. And that international cooperation may have been symbolized most importantly by the United Nations, but it's much more than the United Nations. It's by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and many, many other international organizations as well. And what we see with President Trump is the withdrawing of support for that international order. That's no small thing. That may be the most important single development that we see over the last 2 years. That international order that was created after World War II it contributed to, literally 70 years of general peace in Europe. We didn't have another First World War since 1945. We didn't have another Second World War since 1945. We've had small wars on the periphery, wars such as in Korea and Vietnam. You saw the Soviets involved in a war in Afghanistan and so forth, and of course we know what's happened in the Middle East in recent years. But the kind of general catastrophe that the world experienced between 1939 and 1945 has not materialized. And the reason is because of this international order, which includes, I might add, the creation of the European Union. Trump is at war with virtually all of these organizations, and I think you'd have to put a big question mark as to whether or not we're going to be able to maintain international prosperity as well as international peace in light of what I think is happening to the Republican Party right now.
We're talking live this morning on our live Newsmaker line with Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I'd like to talk a little about the Koch brothers and George Soros. Also want to get in that today and this day in history was the beginning of the Berlin airlift in 1948. I want to pick Dr. Ostrower's brain a little bit about that. Stay with us.
Every Thursday throughout the summer, join us at 1 Steuben Square in Hornell for the Hornell Farmers Market. We have local farm vendors selling handmade crafts, jewelry, homemade jellies and breads, farm fresh produce, natural and organic. We will also have farm wineries, cideries, and breweries from time to time. Stop by and check us out from noon to 4 on Thursdays, and then stay for Thursdays in the Park starting at 4 o'clock. And as always, thank you for shopping Hornell.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, you said it was going to be cool for a while. Wondering how long will this cool weather last?
Well, Brian, we're going to start to come out of it where you've got cooler temperatures today. It's actually going to be pretty comfortable across the region. A little bit of rain tomorrow with a storm system passing north. It looks like a heat wave that'll build across the area starting on Thursday. It'll really start to build up over the weekend through about the 4th of July holiday. And it looks like around the 4th or 5th, we'll start to cool things off, and that cooling will arrive by the 6th. So the good news is we get a nice warm weekend across the region that lasts into the 4th of July, and then we'll turn it more comfortable by the end of next week. So looks like this cool pattern is breaking down. But once again this morning, Brian, 31 degrees at Saranac Lake this morning up in the 3 out of 4 weeks this month they've gotten that cool. Today, sunshine will continue. We're kind of partly to mostly sunny this morning with some high cloudiness out there. More clouds thicken. Temperatures around 80. We'll cloud up tonight. We're going to fall back to about, looks like 60 or 65 overnight. Tomorrow, cloudy, breezy. Chance for showers and storms. Temperatures 75 to 80. The showers and thunderstorms start to wind down tomorrow night, 65 to 70. And then we turn partly sunny. We're 75 to 80 Thursday, and much warmer for Friday and Saturday, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower from Alfred University. Dr. Ostrower, I checked the History Channel's website, history.com, and they say that the Berlin airlift began in 1948 on this day. That would be June the 26th, 1948. Your thoughts on that, Gary?
Well, the Berlin airlift was one of the major components of that early Cold War. The World War II, of course, ended in 1945. Before World War II, we had about 7, what we called back in those days, great powers. That included Japan, Italy, Germany, the United States, England, France, and, of course, Russia. At the end of the war, we didn't have 7 great powers. We had 2, and we no longer call them great powers. We now call them superpowers. So you had the Soviet Union and its allies aligned on one side of Europe. You had the United States and Canada along with their allies on the other side of Europe and the western side of Europe, and tensions grew. Some of that was economic, some of that was political, some of that was strategic, some of that was military, and of course it was ideological. Communism on one hand versus free market capitalism on the other. Well, in 1945, at the end of the war, Germany was divided. And it was divided so that presumably it would never do again what it had done in 1914 when it launched the First World War, and of course 1939 when it began the Second World War, at least in Europe. And that division of Germany meant 3 sections for the Western powers, the United States, England, and France, and of course in the East, 1 section that would be headed up by the Soviet Union. And the agreement was that all major decisions concerning Germany would be joint decisions. All 4 countries would have to agree. But by 1948, because of the increasing tensions between the East and the West, the United States and Britain and France decided that they would no longer consult the Soviet Union in respect to issues that were economic, most importantly having to do with a single German currency. So they made their own currency. And in response, the Soviets claimed, well, the United States and England, France had violated the agreement about joint decision-making, and therefore they blocked American access to our American zone in Berlin. And the problem with Berlin was that the city of Berlin existed right in the middle of that Soviet zone. So the Soviets blocked land access, automobiles, trains, and so forth, access into Berlin. This is a long explanation, I think, maybe more than you anticipated. But in either case, while they blocked land access, they did not block air access. And consequently, the U.S. organized an airlift that lasted for just over a year, mainly utilizing DC-3 kinds of cargo planes to bring oil, to bring food, to bring clothes, to bring medicine, to bring just about everything to sustain life in Western Berlin. And finally, when it became absolutely clear that the Berlin airlift, as it was called, was not going away, the Soviets finally conceded that, all right, they will once again allow for land access into Berlin. But it was a defining moment in some ways, in the sense that it convinced the Germans that we were on their side. That's no longer the case, not under President Trump, obviously, with the tension you have between Trump on one hand and Angela Merkel on the other. But that certainly was the case back then. It was a formative moment in the creation of that Western alliance. Within 1 year, in fact, within less than a year, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what we call NATO, was formed as a means of counteracting Soviet power in Europe.
Interesting answer there, Dr. Ostrower. Now, I did want to get in, and this will be my final question, a question about the Koch brothers and George Soros, who these are big donors in the political world and very organized in the behind the scenes in politics. The conservatives argue that George Soros is behind a lot of the organized protests that we've seen in the last few years. The Democrats, such as Hornell Mayor Sean Hogan, who was on yesterday, talk about how the Koch brothers will do things like form protests and organize against high-speed rail because they say it's against the Koch brothers' interests. Do you have any thoughts on the influence of the Koch brothers and George Soros there, Dr. Ostrower?
The influence of George Soros has been greatly exaggerated. That's not to say he doesn't have any influence. He has a lot of money. But he does not have, and he has never exerted the kind of organizational efforts that the Koch brothers have. The Koch brothers have set up about 200 different organizations, kind of ghost organizations or shadow organizations, not utilizing their own name, but funded by themselves, and which have been on the state level, every bit as much, in fact, on the state level even more than the national level, responsible, I think, for turning state governments, state legislatures, governors' races, and so forth in a Republican direction. One shouldn't underestimate the importance of what they've done. There was a fine book about this by an author named Jane Mayer, which outlines what is this, kind of dark. I don't want to call it a conspiracy, but it's a sort of a hidden movement to serve their own interests. Soros, on the other hand, is he comes from a European background, a Hungarian background, very, very wealthy guy. He has indeed supported democratic causes, liberal causes, progressive causes, and not only in the United States, but in Europe. But without the organizational framework that the Koch brothers have, his influence is not going to be 1/10 of what they have exerted. On the other hand, if you're looking for scapegoats, if you're looking for devils out there, hey, the name of George Soros is going to work for you, and that's why many of the Republican conservatives have kind of, I think, elevated his importance in this whole debate.
Dr. Ostrower, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much for coming on. Very interesting show this morning.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and get outside and enjoy some of that sunlight.
Alrighty, thank you so much, Dr. Ostrower. It's AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.
So over